Good evening and welcome to BronxTalk. New York's 15th Congressional District is the only congressional district that covers only the Bronx. The other Bronx districts also contain parts of other boroughs, Manhattan, Queens, or even up in Westchester. But the 15th is all Bronx. So let's get right to it. Representing only the Bronx in the 15th Congressional District, welcome back to BronxTalk, Representative Ritchie Torres. Congressman, nice to have you with us.
It's always an honor to be here.
And you've been here a number of times. We were just talking about it, and we're going to just keep it going.
Of course.
The news is as current as it could be. This morning, now we shoot this show Thursdays, and then it airs Monday, so Thursday, you were with the Bronx Borough President, the Bronx Development Corporation. You announced a $10 million loan program to help small to medium-sized Bronx businesses with working capital. Who's going to get the funding? What's it going to be used for? I'm assuming you're happy about this.
It is a win for the small businesses of the Bronx. And the most common complaints I receive from small businesses is, one, a lack of access to capital, and two, the crushing cost of doing business in a time of inflation, rapidly rising interest rates, and in a city as expensive as in New York. In the United States, there's a severe shortage of small business lending, and nowhere is it more severe than in a place like the Bronx, where small businesses are often left behind by the big banks. You know, the larger banks have an incentive to hand out larger loans to larger businesses in order to generate larger profits, and that system has fundamentally failed the people of the Bronx. And so my view is, when the market is failing to meet the needs of small businesses in the Bronx, the government has to fill that gaping hole in small business lending. And that's exactly what we've done by launching a $10 million Community Advantage loan fund exclusively for the Bronx. And not only does it include $10 million in federal funding, but it includes a federal guarantee. We, the federal government, will guarantee 85% of the value of these loans.
Unlike some other grants, which somehow disappear before they find their way into Bronx hands.
And it's worth noting, this is a partnership with the Bronx Borough President and with BXEDC and the governor's office.
Yeah, and they're going to make sure that it gets to where it needs to go. I can't tell you how many times I heard from Bronx businesses, I heard there was COVID relief money. I applied. I never got through. They told me I didn't do it right. I didn't qualify. This is not going to be that, I assume.
Well, people are asking, why are you creating a loan fund specifically for the Bronx? And my response is simple. History has shown that whenever you create a citywide or nationwide program,
that's right,
the Bronx is left behind. So when the federal government had a loan program for COVID, only 7% of those loans went to the Bronx. When the city had its program, only 2% of the loans went to the Bronx, compared to 57% for Manhattan.
It's it's something we talk about in many forms on this program all the time. Who's going to get it, and how do they get it? I mean, let's just tell businesses who say, well, wait a minute, I could use $50,000 for a new awning or whatever it is that they need. And they go through the Bronx Development Corporation?
Yeah, so BXEDC, which is under the purview of the Bronx Borough President, is going to be the lead in administering the program. And the purpose of the program is to target the most underserved businesses, the smallest of small businesses. And you could be eligible for loans up to $350,000.
I have to tell you, you drive down the Grand Concourse, and in a way, I can't believe all those businesses survive. And I could see some of the, I've been there, I've been to the deli there for 40 years, and I just can't believe they have enough capital. This would be a great way of doing it. Let's move on. We got about 100 issues we're going to get to one way or the other. The Cross Bronx Expressway. You have been one of the people at the bottom level here saying we've got to do something about it. It's not only split Bronx communities, but it's been affecting Bronx lungs for generations. It's one of the most congested highways in the nation. Where are we at? What's it going to take, to cap it or do something with it that will ease the burden on our home borough?
Well, as you know, we continue to be haunted by the ghost of Robert Moses, whose legacy includes the Cross Bronx Expressway, which has left behind decades of disinvestment and environmental degradation. We in the Bronx have the highest rates of asthma hospitalization because of highways like the Cross Bronx, which has split the borough in half. So we're in the process of engaging with the community to determine how should we reimagine the Cross Bronx. I have a vision for capping the Cross Bronx and installing electrostatic filters that would prevent air pollutants from recirculating in the air, because that would be a powerful strategy for radically reducing air pollution in the Bronx. The difference in life expectancy between the South Bronx and the Upper East Side of Manhattan can be as much as 10 years. And that life expectancy gap
that is quite disturbing. 10 years.
10 years. And look, most of your health is determined not by individual choices, but by the social environment in which you find yourself. And when it comes to the social environment of the Bronx, the 800-pound gorilla in the room is the Cross Bronx Expressway. Notice during COVID, when most people were staying at home, asthma hospitalization actually fell dramatically, which tells me that the outdoor environment, more than the indoor environment, is the main factor in causing asthma.
Shocking. Actually shocking. Thank you for bringing that up. You are, I guess, a fan of congestion pricing. You like the idea of it, and you came up with a $155 million environmental mitigation package. Why do we need a mitigation package, and where are we at? I know that you were not thrilled with New Jersey's opposition to this congestion pricing.
Well, I originally had concerns about the governor's congestion pricing plan, because the environmental assessment indicated that there would be a diversion of diesel truck traffic from the Central Business District in Manhattan to the Cross Bronx Expressway in the South Bronx. And I made it crystal clear that I cannot support a congestion pricing plan that treats the South Bronx as a dumping ground for Manhattan's diesel truck traffic. Having said that, the governor heard my concerns, and she committed to investing $155 million to address the public health and environmental needs of the Bronx. So there's $25 million for green spaces, $20 million for EV charging infrastructure, $20 million for clean trucks, $15 million to replace the refrigerated truck units at the Hunts Point Terminal Market. And replacing those units could reduce particulate matter pollution by as much as 90% in the Hunts Point area. There's going to be $10 million for roadside vegetation to improve outdoor air quality, $10 million for asthma filtration units in schools near highways to improve indoor air quality, and $20 million for a Bronx asthma clinic. So those are only a few of the investments that have been promised by the governor as a result of congestion pricing. It's
interesting about when to the general public, when you talk about monies, $150 million or even the $10 million for Bronx businesses, I always try to break it down. And like for the $10 million for Bronx businesses, and I use the word the $50,000 for $50,000 for a Bronx business would be extraordinary. And so you say, because the government throws around $150 million, and it sounds like, well, I don't know, I guess that's what it costs. But that can really do some projects. I'm assuming you think that.
If you're a small business and you're looking for a $5,000 loan or a $50,000 loan, there is almost no bank in America that will provide it to you. There is no real market for small business lending.
Especially if you don't have the kind of capital that you would need, or the kind of investment in those kinds of things.
Right. And the grassroots entrepreneurs in the Bronx face deeply ingrained barriers to accessing capital, and that's the need that we're addressing.
EV charging, you have been a fan of it. You have put some resource into it. Let's see, the electro vehicle charging super hub will be at 140th Street in Port Morris. Well located. If we can take some gas producing or some pollution producing vehicles off the road, let's just talk about that. And I guess the movement to move that forward.
So the strategy, the best strategy for combating climate change is electrification. It's to electrify every segment of the U.S. economy, including transportation. Transportation is the leading contributor to climate change. And so we have to electrify transportation, electrify vehicles. In order for consumers to buy and use electric vehicles, we need these charging stations. And so the borough president, a company known as Revel, and myself, we announced the largest EV charging infrastructure in the history of the Bronx. It's going to be at Port Morris. And it's notable for two reasons. First, it's going to be public. It's going to be available to the general public. And second, it's going to be fast charging. Unlike most electric
chargers, you gotta sit there with a refrigerated truck. Oh, I get it. Right.
This is going to be in a matter of minutes.
Wow.
So we're looking to create the electric equivalent of gas stations. It only takes a few minutes to fill the pump. It should only take a few minutes to charge an electric vehicle.
As somebody who has a car and drives around the city in the Bronx often, I'm always concerned that the technology hasn't caught up with the environmental need.
Right.
Are we going to get there? I guess then that has to also come out of the federal government, some way of moving the automakers forward to make them technically effective. Or am I wrong? And I just haven't really
You're
learned?
exactly right, because what matters is not only the quantity, but also the quality of the EV charging infrastructure. And what makes this announcement revolutionary is that it's going to be state-of-the-art, ultra-fast charging infrastructure in the Bronx available to the public. It's going to charge your electric vehicle in a matter of minutes. It's the electric equivalent of a gas station. That's how I think about it.
I was just evaluating all these comments about, like why transportation and why we spend so much time on it. And then I realized we're also getting the 4 Metro North stations.
Yes.
And so, I was thinking about people in transit deserts historically in the East Bronx. And when we were talking about congestion pricing, where, that puts them at a disadvantage. But maybe those Metro North stations will make up for that a little bit.
The Metro North stations are going to be a game changer for combating climate change in the Bronx. But it's also going to save not only money, but time. It's going to reduce the commute by as much as 75 minutes.
I'm sure.
75 minutes. It actually will take 15 minutes to get from Hunts Point to Penn Station, which is pretty impressive.
I don't live in the East Bronx, but I'm always thinking about my friends in Co-op City, and they say, boy, I work on 30th Street in the West Side in Manhattan. That's forever. Let's just move ahead to the migrant crisis, which is part federal and now very local. The mayor and governor are at loggerheads. I mean, it was front page of the Daily News the other day. Governor's critical of the mayor's critical of the governor, saying she's not doing enough. She says he's not doing enough. And this is where the federal government comes in. The mayor's been directly critical of President Biden and saying, hey, wait a minute, where's our stuff? How do you evaluate what's going on and what needs to be done? Are you going to say somebody's at fault? Or how do you see this whole problem of 100,000 new people in New York City?
There's no question that the federal government has fundamentally failed the city of New York. The wave of migration that has swept New York City has put unprecedented strain on the shelter system. About more than 90,000 people have entered New York City's intake system. More than 50,000 remain in the care of the New York City shelter system, which has effectively doubled the family shelter population in the span of a year. That's unsustainable. And the mayor claims that the migrant crisis is going to create up to a $12 billion hole in the city budget. And I agree with the mayor. The federal government has fallen short. The federal government has only appropriated $140 billion for New York City, which falls catastrophically short of that $12 billion hole in the city's budget. And I do believe that the president should grant work authorization to the migrants who are here. The migrants who are here want to work, want to provide for themselves and their families. We should give them the opportunity to contribute to the economy, to contribute to themselves. There's no point in denying work authorization.
I want to propose something that I thought about. We took a drive this summer to a couple of upstate towns, and we saw main streets that had no stores, that were empty. It seems to me, if you pick whatever number, migrants, as you said, they want to come here, they want to work, they want to have strong families. Nobody has proven that they want to do it almost more than them, what they've been through to get there. What if the city really, and would have to involve the state and maybe the Fed, work with some of these towns, take 40 or 50 families, whether you build housing or there are empty homes everywhere up north, and you work with them and you got them grants to open businesses, you'd create, and those towns that are starving economically would get something out of it. I mean, that's Gary's idea, and I'm not elected or anything else. I'm just a guy here. But what do you think?
Look, I agree with you. The federal government, the state, and the city should be coordinating to ensure that every locality, every state is sharing in the burden. Like the United States should be a sanctuary for asylum seekers across the world. We're a large country of 330 million people. We can afford to absorb immigrants, but the burden has to be distributed equitably rather than solely falling on the shoulders of New York City.
If the federal government provides money and says, okay, we're going to do it, or you work it out in Congress, what would you use it for? You're building housing, emboldening and increasing our capacity in the shelter system? What would you do with that money to help the migrants get settled and be part of America?
Look, it's mostly shelter, but obviously a wave of migration is going to impose strain on the school system as well. But to be blunt, more funding is unlikely given Republican control of the House. So the best course of action is work authorization, which I believe that's something the president can do unilaterally without approval from Congress.
So that people can get jobs.
Because once you have a job, you can provide yourself with shelter.
The timing of your appearance here coincided for me perfectly with the Georgia indictments of the former president. Just what are your thoughts when you see it? I know you had always been outspoken about getting things right. And we talked about how you were on this program right after you took office for the first time, and they had just climbed the walls of the Capitol. So as you watch the thing unfold, what do you think?
Well, as you know, I assumed office on January 3rd of 2021, and January 6th was my third day on the job.
I know, because a week later you were here telling us the story.
So for me, the crimes of the former president are not an abstraction to me. It's something that I saw with my own eyes. It's quite striking that we have a former president, the leading candidate for the Republican nomination, facing 4 indictments on 91 felonies. And it only takes one conviction on one of those felonies to send him to prison. And so for the good of the country, he should step down. But Donald Trump is so narcissistic as to be incapable of acting in anyone's interest beyond his own. Of the 4 indictments, 2 of them are about his attempt to overturn the election. The most interesting one is the Georgia indictment, because it is targeting not only Donald Trump, but 18 of his associates, his co-conspirators, including Rudy Giuliani. And the Fulton County prosecutor is applying the RICO statute. Now, as you know, the RICO statute is historically reserved for the prosecution of organized crime, the mafia.
And ironically, partially created by former mayor.
Pioneered by Rudy Giuliani. But the DA is essentially claiming that Donald Trump and Rudy Giuliani and his associates were part of a criminal enterprise that corruptly conspired to overturn the 2020 election. And you're right, there is a cruel irony here. Rudy Giuliani got his start as a federal prosecutor against organized crime. And now toward the end of his life, he's the target of a federal prosecution against organized crime.
If you made a movie about it, you wouldn't believe it. I want to just talk about...
Am I occupying the seat that he once held in Bronx?
Well, he was here in the 90s. We can talk about BronxNet's 30th anniversary. In the 90s, Rudy Giuliani was in this room, and we interviewed him. But I want to talk a little bit about bipartisanship. You signed on to a bipartisan bill called the Abraham Accords. You were enthusiastic about it. Do you think that now that I mentioned earlier, it's like an incendiary device thrown into Congress, now all of a sudden there's another indictment of Donald Trump and the partisan lines are being drawn. Is bipartisanship off the table in Washington? Do you still feel like you can talk to Congress members across the aisle to do things that are worthwhile, get funding for Bronx initiatives?
Since January 6th, I think we're in a period of peak polarization and partisanship in Washington, D.C. So it's more challenging than it's ever been. But, despite the atmosphere of partisan politics, I've managed to develop strong relationships with Republicans on the other side. So my committee chair in financial services is Patrick McHenry from North Carolina. I have a wonderful working relationship with him. The chair of the China committee, Mike Gallagher from Wisconsin, have a working relationship with him. And I partnered with Mike Lawler from Rockland County, New York, to establish to pass a bill that would establish a special envoy for the Abraham Accords, which to me is the greatest peace agreement in the history of the Middle East. It has the potential to create a Middle East in which Jews, Christians, and Muslims are living in a future of shared peace and prosperity, which is something that should be bipartisan.
I was happy that I opened up my newspaper last night and I saw that you had a letter in the local papers about your concern about judicial reform in Israel, but yet you still support Israel. Just talk about your concerns and then, why you're still enthusiastic about supporting Israel.
Yeah, so my personal views on judicial reform in Israel should have no bearing on America's commitment to the security of Israel, right? Israel's our most important ally in the Middle East. But I do have concerns about the judicial reforms. The notion of overriding the decisions of the Supreme Court by a simple majority in the Knesset, that would undermine the independence of the judiciary.
Could you imagine if we did that here?
Yeah. And the Israeli system is different from the American system. So in America, we have a vertical separation of powers between the federal government and the state. We have a horizontal separation of powers among the three branches of government. And the American system is full of checks and balances, a bicameral legislature, presidential veto, the filibuster, judicial review. In Israel, there are very few checks and balances, right? There's a parliamentary system in which there is no independent executive. The executive is a creature of the Knesset, and the only check on the political power of the Knesset is the independent Supreme Court. And if the independence of the Supreme Court is eroded, you lose to checks and balances. That I believe is the cornerstone of liberal democracy.
I was going to say, and I hope we don't lose, a very important democratic nation because they are shifting. But I guess time will tell. One more national question.
But I think it's worth noting every democracy has challenges, and we're no exception. As you know, as Donald Trump demonstrates every day.
Congressman, look in the mirror. Let's just do a couple of local things before we run out of time. The whole question about the Medicare Advantage plan for New York City retirees seems to have been answered now, that the courts have said, well, that the city can't do this. Where is this at? Do I have it wrong?
Not quite. So it's subject to appeal, and the city has announced that it would appeal the decision.
That is going to appeal. Okay.
And my view is senior citizens should have the power to choose between traditional Medicare and Medicare Advantage. But Medicare Advantage should never be imposed on our seniors. It should be freely chosen. And there are large employers like the city of New York that are depriving senior citizens of their right to choose the health care that's best for them.
And
here's the problem.
It'll be in the court's hands.
It's going to continue to be the subject of litigation. But here's the problem. Medicare has a much broader network than Medicare Advantage. Not every doctor who accepts Medicare will accept Medicare Advantage. And so if you're a cancer patient who is suddenly shifted to Medicare Advantage, you're at risk of experiencing a disruption in your healthcare when you can least afford it. And that's unacceptable.
Along with Councilman Dinowitz and Assemblyman Jeffrey Dinowitz, you signed a letter to the mayor urging regulatory considerations before they move ahead with a proposal to build a temporary cricket stadium for 34,000 fans in Van Cortland Park. How do you see it? Why did you think that it needs some sort of legislative review before they can just say, okay, let's put it here?
Look, I mean, state law is crystal clear that the city cannot alienate parkland without the approval of the state legislature. And it would seem to me that if you are withholding park space from the public for 6 months or longer and you're installing a cricket stadium, which was a use that was never envisioned for Van Cortland Park.
Well, certainly they play cricket in Van Cortland Park, but certainly not that kind of a structure on what has been, for more than a century.
But it would seem to me that a massive restructuring of Van Cortland Park constitutes the kind of park alienation that requires the approval of the state legislature. And so I've taken the same position as my Riverdale colleague, Assemblyman Jeff Dinowitz.
And so we'll see. I mean, the plans have not been clear. Got a final question for you. There was an interesting article about the Times about the Inflation Reduction Act. Yeah. It was very interesting because they said, well, inflation is down. I'm sure we're all thrilled about that. But they said that the priorities like clean energy, lowering drug prices, raising corporate taxes was part of that whole picture.
Yes.
Talk about the president said the law was one of the biggest drivers of job and economic growth that the country has ever seen. Do you agree with that? And is that a good way to get some of those other agendas through?
Well, the Inflation Reduction Act is one of the most transformative pieces of legislation in American history. It's going to set our country on a trajectory to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2030, which is a game changer for a clean energy economy. For the first time in history, it empowers the federal government to negotiate affordable drug prices with the pharmaceutical companies. And so by September, Health and Human Services is going to come out with 10 drugs where the federal government is going to negotiate lower prices on behalf of seniors. And the Inflation Reduction Act caps the price of insulin at $35 a month for senior citizens on Medicare, which is a game changer because there are about 100 million Americans who are either diabetic or pre-diabetic for whom insulin is a necessity in the present or could be a necessity in the future.
Congressman, we could keep going, but we're just about out of time. And just folks don't know, but before the program, we were talking about this is your 15th appearance on the program.
I'm getting old.
Well, older anyway. But speaking of getting old,
I'm still young by the standards of Congress.
That's for darn sure. Yeah. But I just want to mention, and folks may or may not know, this is the 30th anniversary of BronxNet Television, and this conversation is as good an example of the importance of BronxNet Television as anything else you see on our 4 channels, because we put you closer to your elected officials. In addition, you look at over our 30 years, whether it's, and on this program, BronxTalk is 29 years old, arts and culture. We want to learn about healthcare, we want to learn about the environment, we want to learn about racial justice in all different forms. It's here on 4 channels on BronxNet Television. I will tell the congressman and our viewers, some people don't know, I had the very first piece when they turned on BronxNet Television. We had a news show at the time, and the very first piece was a piece that I did about a teenager who was a national chess champion. And we used that to explain to the general public what BronxNet was going to be about great people in the Bronx that nobody knows about. I thank you, Congressman Torres. BronxNet thanks mostly our audience. Thank you for being with us 30 years. I don't know, you're going to be here another 30 years, maybe. We'll see.
I can only hope.
Thank you so much for your time. And again, thanks to Michael Max and all our friends at BronxNet Television. And of course, thanks to our producer, Rebecca Hemick, our director, Nick Marrero, and of course, the cast of thousands who help us out here in the studio. Next week, something we've never done before in our 29 years, a fun show about Bronx pets and the new pet center opening in Co-op City. So if the curtain don't fall and the creek don't rise, we'll see you next week. Good night.